Well, welcome back, amazing students, and thank you for joining for another exciting lecture of lifespan development. And so I am looking forward to today's lecture in particular because we are going to be discussing a topic that's not always easy to discuss. But one of the things that's a passion of mine, where I've spent the last 15 years of my career in social work, has been serving children and families, children in particular who have been victims to child abuse and neglect. The reason why we're going to discuss child abuse, in particular what is referred to as child maltreatment, in your lifespan development course is because child abuse in particular has severe impact and consequences for lifespan development, not only in the immediate sense of when the abuse has taken place, but also child maltreatment has short-term, long-term implications for an individual who has experienced trauma early on in their life. Child maltreatment in particular can send an individual on a trajectory, if you will, of challenges later in life, both physiological, emotional, and psychological, depending on the abuse that has taken place. And so for me, for the last 15 years, a passion of mine has been working to break the cycle of child abuse within our communities, as well as heal those who have experienced pain at the hands of child abuse. And so I'm bringing you this topic today because it has a direct implication to lifespan development. And we'll talk about that in the course of today's lecture. So really for today's lecture, we're looking to do four things. Define child abuse or child maltreatment. That's the term that we use to discuss child abuse. We're going to understand, I hope for you is to understand the phenomena of child abuse nationally and locally at the end of this lecture. What we're going to do is identify the signs of child abuse. We're going to understand mandated child abuse reporting and its processes. And finally, what I'm going to do is in today's lecture discussing a study some of you may have heard of is the ACES study, or Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This is a study that has profound significance in understanding lifespan development, how child abuse at a young age will manifest itself as adults throughout the lifespan, okay, without treatment and without it being addressed. And what I'm going to do is provide you with some information on how we can address child abuse in order to prevent the complications as discovered in the ACES study. All right, for your future career as a helping profession, if that's something that you are choosing to do. So this information today will be definitely applicable to your future careers if you're looking at working with children or families in any sort of way. If you're looking at serving individuals who are adults later on in life, if they've experienced abuse and neglect in their past, then this lesson will definitely also be applicable to your careers. Okay, so on the next slide, we'll go ahead and dive into some definitions of child abuse, as well as some local statistics and national statistics related to child maltreatment. It's difficult to discuss child maltreatment without first defining what child maltreatment is, right? And so child maltreatment has a very broad definition that you'll see here, but is defined as any intentional harm to a minor, that's any individual obviously under the age of 18 years old, right? Including actions that harm the child physically, emotionally, sexually, and through neglect. Okay, now this definition comes to us from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, updated in 2016. Also, quick note, you can also find this definition on page 233 of your textbook. Don't know why the little island with the palm trees there. It looks nice, but don't know why it's there. So disregard that, okay? Now, what's important to note in this definition is that intentional harm includes actions, right, that affect the child physically, emotionally, sexually, or through neglect. Now, that may be in the case of child maltreatment, one of those areas that's impacted. But more often than not, what I have seen is individuals, children who have faced childhood trauma have been usually impacted in more than just one of these areas. Usually there's multiple areas, two or three of these areas, if not all of them, that have been impacted. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on with some statistics related to child abuse. And these are some national statistics related to child abuse. A child abuse report is made every 10 seconds within the United States, and every day 5 children die as a result of child abuse throughout our country. Every year, over 3.6 million child abuse referrals are made. And when you consider that a child abuse referral can include multiple children in the home, the result of that, what that really looks like, is about 6.6 million children impacted every year by child abuse in the United States. These numbers here are staggering, right? And part of the role, my role as a social worker, and if you choose to enter into one of the helping professions later, part of your role will be is to stop this cycle of child abuse from occurring, both locally and nationally, right? So what I thought would be important to note is to explore some of the child abuse related statistics to Riverside County in particular. So you can see how these numbers, all right, manifest themselves within Riverside County here close to home. And so these numbers come to us from 2017, all right, these statistics here related to data, all right, that was reflected in the year 2016. These numbers won't be far off in terms of current numbers. And so it's important to note that what you're seeing here is a fair representation of what we're currently experiencing as well. So there were, in 2016, 58,000 calls, nearly 59,000 calls to the Child Abuse Hotline, or the Children's Services Division, what we refer to as CSD, in Riverside County. All right. Now, those 58,000 calls were made to a hotline, and when you call the Child Abuse Hotline to report suspected child abuse, a social worker picks up on the other end. And from there, the social worker needs to determine if those calls were related to suspected abuse and neglect of a child. Now, of those 58,000, nearly 59,000 calls, almost 30,000 of those calls, 50%, okay, were reports related to suspected abuse and neglect. So you can call the hotline, child abuse hotline, for other issues outside of suspected abuse, but 50% of those calls were related directly to, suspected abuse and neglect of a child. Now, during 2016, there were 38,000, allegations of child maltreatment within the county. What that looks like is an average rate of about 65.8 calls related to child maltreatment allegations, all right, per 1,000 children in the county. That's a pretty significant number. Now, of allegations received from Child Services Division, 86% of those were investigated by a social worker. And so in the field of social work, we have what are referred to as frontline emergency response workers, whose job is to go out and investigate the allegations of child abuse to determine if those allegations are substantiated or unsubstantiated. Okay, substantiated meaning that there was something to those reports which were significant, leading to abuse or neglect taking place. Unsubstantiated meaning it could not be determined at that time. Now, of all of those calls, 33,000, 5,000 were found to be substantiated, And as a result of these 5,000 being substantiated, what it equated to was about 1,500, you can't see it on this chart, I apologize, about 1,500 to 1,700 children entering the foster care system for the first time, meaning that they had to unfortunately be removed from their families of origin and placed into foster care. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, 1,500 kids out of 58,000 calls is doesn't seem that big. It doesn't seem like that many kids. Well, also consider anytime we remove a kiddo from their family of origin, that's a traumatic experience. Imagine being pulled away from your families, even if an abuse was occurring in the home, and moved to another home to live in, moved and then overseen your case by a social worker, right? This is a traumatic experience for children. What's also important to note is not necessarily the number of kiddos who entered care for the first time, but also to note that there were 58,000 calls made to the hotline in 2016. Those are 58,000 calls from the community saying something isn't right in this household, that there's something wrong with what's happening in this household. And maybe I can't put my finger on it, but I know things aren't okay. And so within our community in 2016, 58,000 calls were made saying something isn't right and there's a child present in that home. When we look at it from that standpoint, this is a significant number and really speaks to a symptom of a greater problem that's existing within our community related to child abuse, child maltreatment. Okay, let's stop for a moment in our discussion related to child maltreatment, and let's consider something here. Um, there's a Japanese proverb which says a child's life is like a piece of paper on which everyone leaves a mark, right? And I'd like for you to imagine for a second that you have a blank piece of paper in front of you, just a blank, clean sheet of paper. Maybe it's just a piece of printer paper, right, that's in front of you. And imagine that you took that ball of paper and you rolled up that paper and you maybe tore the edges and you stomped on it on the ground, right? And then you pick up that piece of paper and you try to put the paper exactly back to the way it was before, exactly how it looked before. Now you know that that would be impossible to do, that there's no way we could ever return that paper to what it was before. I like to use that analogy to consider that if we look at a child's life and we look at episodes of trauma and maltreatment that a child undergoes in the period of their childhood as they move into life, um, you may be able to ease some of the corners. You may be able to straighten the paper a little bit, right? But nothing will ever return exactly the way it was. So what's important to understand is that when I move into statistics and data related to child abuse, it's also important to understand and not lose sight of the fact that we're talking about human lives, individuals who have been impacted significantly by trauma that never will fully leave that individual. They will carry that with them the rest of their lives. It doesn't mean that we'll become always decapacitating, paralyzing. Many individuals move from being victims of trauma to survivors, right, of trauma, where the trauma no longer takes a foothold on their life. But it's also important to realize we can never erase the trauma that has taken place. I'd like to show you a very quick video. And we're going to do something a little different today because I want to say I apologize. The video link that I'm using for this video was very difficult to draw down and put on VoiceThread. Um, um, as a result of whatever copyright or issues that I was experiencing with it. So I couldn't embed it in the lecture. So I'm going to ask you at this point to refer to Blackboard. If after you're done with this slide is to move over to Blackboard and check out the video called The Missing Piece. The Missing Piece was written by Shel Silverstein. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with his work, Light in the Attic, The Giving Tree, most famous for Shel Silverstein. Some amazing work, very profound. And this video is referred to as The Missing Piece. And so I'd like for you for a moment to jump onto Blackboard, find the link that I've uploaded for you there to watch The Missing Piece. It's a very short video animated with the poem of The Missing Piece on there. And I'd like for you to just take a moment and allow that to set in. I'd like you, when you watch the video, to kind of think about then this notion of a missing piece in a child's life. And let's say that missing piece is there as a result of trauma. What a child continues to look for in their life throughout their lifespan, even beyond childhood, in order to fill that missing piece, that void that's been created in their life, in their being as a result of the trauma that's experienced. And then come back to the next slide and we'll commence with the lecture. I think what's important to understand if you had finished watching that video on the missing piece, is I love that video. I think it's really powerful to watch, right? At times I've played that video for foster parents and adoptive parents, and we talk about some of the challenges they're facing related to the children that are in their care. And I always bring it back to this notion of children looking for their missing piece throughout their life, looking for something or someone to fill that void that has been created through abuse and neglect that they have experienced. And so as a child is going about looking for that, it's not always easy. It's painful for both the child and the people that are involved in that quest, but it's ever so important for that child to have an opportunity to continue to roll along and search for that missing piece, right? So I also want to clue us into some biblical lessons related to what the Bible says about children, right? And I think it's important to understand, because if you identify as a Christian, if your faith is something that roots you in the work and the work that you want to pursue when you're completed with your undergraduate degree, then it's also really important to understand that there are some biblical lessons that apply to how we should treat children, how we should value children in our culture, and our responsibility as caregivers, right, to protect children in our culture. These are three particular biblical themes that have guided me throughout my work over the past 15 years in serving children and families, okay? One is that children are to be valued. And we've seen in Mark, right, the scripture verse that people were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant, right? He said to them, "Let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly, I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a child will never enter it." Right? And he took the children in his arms. And so what Jesus did was laid a framework here to say children are valued. And not only do we need to be childlike in our nature, our ability to see the good in people, to trust and to love without condition, right? Unless we can do those things as Christians and hold children in esteem, then we will not enter the kingdom of heaven. I love this verse from Proverbs, right? It says, "Start children off in the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it." And so there is a responsibility for caregivers to teach, and educate our children into the ways in which, as the scripture distinguishes, into the ways that they should go. That we have a responsibility as caregivers to assist our children in leading lives of faith and action, of believing in the lessons that have been taught through scripture. And finally, this scripture verse from Deuteronomy here, right? "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts, to be on your hearts." Imagine that, right? "Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up." So what I draw from this particular scripture verse is that we are elected as caregivers, as adults, to provide supervision and protection to our children, right? This is a word of action that we have been called to do, been placed on our hearts, right? It needs to be the forefront of what drives us and motivates us, is to continue to impress upon the children in our society. Talk with them, right? Engage with them. Walk along the road and engage with our children in this process. And I think it's really important to understand then that all of our roles collectively within society are to provide supervision, education, and protection to our children. Now, what I'm going to do in this next slide is go ahead and discuss some of the definitions of child abuse and neglect. It's really important to understand that the laws surrounding child abuse, neglect are similar in many circumstances, but can also look slightly different depending on the state in which you're in. And so what I'm going to do is give you the definitions of child abuse and neglect according to lifespan development here, and then we'll actually look at the laws associated with it. If you notice, what's primarily important to understand is that there are 4 types of child abuse according to our definition of child maltreatment. There's physical, sexual, emotional, sometimes referred to as psychological abuse, and neglect. All of these categories constitute abuse, and when an individual attempts intentionally to harm a child in one of these categories, that constitutes abuse, okay? And so physical abuse is the intentional use of force, obviously harming the child's health, development, or dignity, right? And that's mostly punishment driven. What I've seen over the years of 15 years of serving children and families is physical abuse is most often associated with punishment, and where a caregiver believes that a child has done something wrong and chooses to punish that child physically. Sexual abuse refers to the participation of a child in sexual acts or acts, okay, one or multiple, aimed towards the physical gratification or financial profit from a person committing the act. So if you notice, when we also discuss financial profiting here, we're also discussing child abuse in regards to sex trafficking, prostitution, things like that. That all falls under sexual abuse. About 30% of children are perpetrated by relatives, okay, who are victims of sexual abuse. Now, emotional and psychological abuse, okay, are referred to as chronic or pervasive. So chronic means ongoing, over a long period of time, or pervasive, okay, same thing. Ignoring, shaming, terrorization, humiliation, IPV, which stands for intimate partner violence or domestic violence, DV, exposure, okay, can amplify that impairment. And so psychological maltreatment in particular is the most challenging and prevalent form of child abuse and neglect. It's also the most difficult to prove. Because under the eyes of the law, the definition of emotional abuse is something that's been ongoing for a long period of time, chronic or pervasive, right? So a parent, time to time may say something awful to a child once or twice because they were stressed out, they were angry, whatever the case was. That may not constitute emotional abuse. However, if for an ongoing extended period of time, that parent or caregiver continues to berate, belittle the child, devalue the child, well, then that obviously will constitute emotional abuse. So this is difficult to prove from time to time. Finally, neglect. Neglect is, separated into four categories: supervisory, physical, medical, emotional, but you can also have educational neglect and abandonment. Okay. And so what's important to understand is neglect, out of all four categories here, okay, is oftentimes the most pervasive form of abuse that brings children to the attention of Child Services Division and child abuse investigators. More often than not, it is neglect that is the main reason why a child may be removed from their biological family and placed into foster care, residential care, or something like that. So that's just these overarching definitions of child maltreatment. Okay, now that we have established the four categories of child maltreatment or child abuse, what I would like to do is spend a little time discussing what are some of the potential warning signs of abuse by category within children. And I also want to draw our attention to the notion of child abuse reporting, specifically who is mandated to report, mandated being required to report by law, and what does the law say about reporting child abuse and suspected child abuse in particular. So what we'll do is we're going to spend a little bit of time unpacking these concepts. Some of the potential warning signs involving child abuse related to emotional abuse in children can be things like excessively being withdrawn, fearful, anxious, or concerned about doing something wrong. Now, it's important to note here the language that is applied, right, to this definition: excessively. So of course we recognize that at time to time children will have anxiety, they'll worry about things, they'll even be afraid of specific moments or time within their life. However, we have to be able to determine, is that fear excessive? Is that emotional response outside of the normal stressors or response to stressors in our lives, right? Showing extreme behavior, either in the form of, on one side of the spectrum, being extremely compliant, or on the other side, extremely demanding, passive or aggressive, right? Again, let's look at the language here. Extreme is the definition. If the child doesn't seem to be attached to the parent or caregiver, they seem to be fairly apathetic to that relationship. They're not excited to see their parents there, nor are they angry. They're just kind of there. That could be an indicator that something is awry. Acts either inappropriately, like adult-like, taking care of other children, or inappropriately infantile, rocking thumb, sucking their thumb, throwing tantrums. So at times, what you'll see are children often having to adopt a role in a household where neglect and emotional abuse is present, where one of the children needs to take the role of the caregiver in seeing to the needs of the other children in the home. Usually, but not all the time, the oldest sibling, if there's multiple children in the home, will play that role and seem over-parentified, is what we have seen. Now, at times also, once that stress is eliminated, we may see that same child, that older child that was playing the role of the parent, later become what we call reverting, okay, in terms of their behavior to an infant-like behavior once that stressor is gone and they no longer have that need to care for those siblings that are there. And so you may see in such cases that same child revert to rocking, thumb sucking, throwing tantrums, almost to the place as when the trauma first took place, right, to that moment in time. And so they may see an individual who's 13 or 14 engaging in behaviors through this notion of regressing, that appears to be 2 or 3 years old. Warning signs of physical abuse in children incur frequent injuries or unexplained bruises or welts. These are children that are showing up to public places with constantly new injuries. Now we know that children love to play, they'll fall, they'll scrape their knee, they'll get a bruise here and there. Also warning signs of where those bruises are occurring. Sometimes in some children I've seen where bruising, new injuries occur in places outside of the norm of where you wouldn't commonly see them, under shirts, right, under clothing, hidden out of view. Now, sometimes what you may see is new injuries manifested, but the child is wearing heavy clothing, right? Even in hot weather. And that brings us down to this one here, wears inappropriate clothing to cover up injuries, such as long sleeve shirts on hot days, hoodies, things like that, right? Is always watchful or alert as waiting for something bad to happen. We refer to this sometimes as hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is when an individual is constantly nervous and in a state of readiness, fearful that something negative is going to happen. Injuries appear to have been a pattern, such as a mark from a hand or a belt. And so at times, unfortunately, I have seen injuries that you can closely see mirror that of a belt. Even the outline of the belt holes have been left on the injury. And so that's something to be aware of. Shying away from touch, flinches suddenly in movements, or seems afraid to go home, right? I've seen where particularly some of the kiddos that I've worked with from time to time, the hardest day for our kiddos during the week when abuse is present in the home is Friday. And more often than not, the reason for that is because they know they're going home, to which they cannot go to school for 2 days. They are in their environment. And so that can be a very anxiety provoking day in which a lot of kiddos may come into the office and simply just state they don't want to go home. Warning signs of neglect in children. Okay, warning signs of neglect in particular. Clothes are ill-fitting, filthy, inappropriate for the weather. So sometimes kiddos, and again, neglect, I want to be careful about this because sometimes situations of neglect can lead to a villainization of the caregivers. And in certain cases, when neglect is done with malice, when caregivers are intentionally depriving their children of specific needs, of course, that is an awful and horrendous act. And that would be something that is horrific in and of itself. But sometimes neglect comes from a place of sheer poverty or an inability to provide for the basic needs of children. So imagine if you have 4 kids, you don't have any work, you're not sure where your next meal is going to come from. $20 for a meal is going to be difficult, let alone $30 or $40 for a jacket. And so some kiddos may be forced to go without or may come to school wearing multiple t-shirts in an event to stay warm instead of wearing that jacket. Hygiene is consistently bad. Unbathed, matted, or unwashed hair, noticeable body odor in a young child could be something as a red flag. Untreated illnesses, physical injuries. Remember, if you refer to that first slide with the 4 categories of abuse, medical neglect was one of those things. Categories of abuse. And so if a child has a broken arm and they've never gone to the doctor, that can constitute abuse, or at least suspected abuse, enough for it to be investigated, for a social worker to make a determination on if that investigation is substantiated or that allegation is substantiated. Another sign could be frequently unsupervised or left alone to play in unsafe situations or environments. More often than not, I've seen where kiddos have been neglected and they have been picked up on the side of the road, in some cases busy streets, 2-year-olds walking in diapers down the street by themselves because their parents were away, they had passed out, they were battling their own addictions, and the child was wandering throughout the neighborhood, and this is what brought them into the system. Or a child who's frequently late or missing from school. Remember, educational neglect is also a category of neglect under child abuse. Here are some warning signs of sexual abuse in children: trouble walking or sitting due to trauma, right, of the genitalia or organs of the body and the child, displaying knowledge or interest in sexual acts inappropriate for his or her age, even seductive behavior. This is a notion which we refer to in child welfare as hypersexualized. And so you may see children who have been victims of sexual abuse who are maybe 4, 5, 6 years old, behaving in seductive ways because that is how they have learned and been communicated to, obviously inappropriately and inaccurately, that is how you seek love and attention from an adult. making strong efforts to avoid a specific person without an obvious reason. And so you'll have individuals sort of attempting children to hide or to not interact with that person. Maybe suddenly they don't want to start going to a birthday party where maybe family members are present. Maybe they don't want to go on outings once a small group is gathered. And so they won't explain why. They may say they're sick. They may say they don't feel well, whatever the case is, when really it's because they are fearful of one of the individuals or multiple that are attending that gathering. Don't want to change clothes in front of others or participate in physical activities. A sexually transmitted disease or even pregnancy, right, under the age of 14 is something to consider, and running away from home. And so what's important to recognize too is I gave you that stat that about 30% of sexual abuse cases occur from a family member. In my experience, that statistic is I'm sure reliable in the sense that that covers national trends and several databases regarding crime reports. For me, though, in my experience in the past 15 years, I believe that percentage in my experience has been higher. The majority of kiddos that I have worked with who have been victims of sexual abuse have been abused by someone close to them in the family, not necessarily from someone outside, although that certainly does happen. What I have seen is the vast majority have occurred within family settings. Mandated child abuse reporting. So here's what I want to talk about. This is the actual penal code section that dictates for the state of California the obligation to report child abuse. Okay, so here's what's important to realize, and I'm going to give you an exhaustive list in the next slide. What I would like for you to consider is when we're discussing child maltreatment, some of you may have that question, well, who reports? Who is the individual that is responsible for reporting this if there is suspected child abuse taking place? Well, what happens is that in California, okay, a list of persons whose profession qualifies them as a mandated reporter, all right, is listed under this penal code here, okay? Now that list continues to grow, but essentially what it involves is anyone who is going to have direct access to working with children. So these are things like school district employees, administrators, coaches. The list is going to go on and on and on. Okay, I'm going to give you that in the next slide. What's important to note is if you are in a paid position and you are also encountering children in your place of work, then chances are you are going to fall under that mandated reporting clause where you are legally responsible. And here's the critical word to that, to report, okay, to report all known or suspected abuse cases. So let's read this particular clause from the penal code in its entirety, right? All persons who are mandated reporters are required by law to report all known or suspected cases of child abuse or neglect. It is not the job of the mandated reporter to determine whether the allegations are valid. Incredibly important here. So some folks may say, well, I don't want to report it because the child said that uncle, touched her inappropriately at a household gathering, but I've met the uncle and he seems so nice and he's this and that, and I'd hate to ruin his life and we don't know for sure. Well, the problem is, all right, is that that's not our job to investigate. Our job is to report suspected or known abuse. And so suspected means that if we have an inkling that something falling under these categories of abuse, some of these warning signs are present, right, are here, then it's our responsibility legally to report that. And then what will happen is a social worker will conduct an investigation to determine if those allegations were substantiated. Okay. Now, it's also important to say, well, how do I make a report? Now, I would like for you to understand the first time that I had to file a child abuse report was intimidating. I was worried. I wasn't sure if I was fulfilling my legal obligation. I will tell you this, and this is something I wish someone had told me. It's not as scary as it seems. All right, the process is user-friendly, fairly easy to do. It involves calling a hotline number. Every county has a hotline number set for child abuse, and there's a form that you can fill out electronically, or you can write that form and fax it in once you have made that phone call. Now, under California law, okay, a report, okay, must contact an appropriate local law enforcement agency or child welfare agency listed below. So these are things like police or sheriff's department, county probation department, county welfare, things like that. So what's important to understand is that later on in this career, if you choose to serve in the helping professions, chances are you will also fall under a category of mandated child abuse reporting. You will receive extensive training on child abuse reporting. But what I wanted to do was just kind of dip our toe in the pool, if you will, of child maltreatment so you understand professionally what some of your obligations will be. Again, very simple, no need to be intimidated by the process, but you should take the process seriously. Fines, loss of license, jail time can even be present if you fail to report suspected abuse, and God forbid something happens to that child, right? So who's required to report, right? Who is it? Look at this list. A lot, right? You see a whole bunch of folks. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but these are specifically all kinds of roles that are responsible. It's important to note some of us think, well, of course, these roles here, a lot of them, right? They're working with children, school settings, things like that. Okay. But also look on this side. I'd like to draw your attention right here, right? District attorneys, investigators. Look at these physician roles within the healthcare field, right? Psychologists, marriage family therapists, right? Animal control officers, right? Anyone who might have any sort of access to children, or be aware of events in where children are involved in a home setting. So I hope that clarifies that for you. Finally, when I said it's important to not be intimidated by the process, but to take the process seriously, this is why. Under California law, it's also important to note, right, that a crime of failure to report is punishable by time in jail, right? 6 months or $1,000 fine, imprisonment, that leads to great bodily injury, right? Imprisonment, or up to 1 year in county jail, or $5,000 fine. Now, some of you are saying, gosh, that seems a little low for an episode of child abuse to go undisclosed. What's also important to note, though, is many of these helping professions also require some sort of licensure, training. They're regulated by a board, the state, something like that. And if you were convicted of one of these crimes, guess what? The license goes with it. And what that means is that your livelihood and your ability to practice your profession under one of these helping professions is terminated at that point. And so it's really important to understand our ethical as well as our legal responsibilities and professional responsibilities with our field to report suspected child maltreatment. Okay, so today we've discussed child maltreatment, particularly what is the definition of child maltreatment. We've discussed other important factors such as the 4 categories of child abuse, as well as some information, some factors to consider, right, that could be indicators of abuse being present in a child's life. And we've discussed the laws associated with mandated child abuse reporting. So what I would like to do is, again, let's continue to just kind of dip our toe in this pool of the topic of child maltreatment, and let's just exercise some of this. So typically I apologize, I would do this as a quick, just kind of fun Q&A in the classroom setting, and I'm a little restricted on being able to bring each slide's animation into play on this particular platform. So what I'm going to do is you're going to have the answers here, all right? And we will discuss sort of the reason for that. So let's just go scenario by scenario here, and let's discuss if this is reportable or not, right? Under suspected child abuse reporting laws. So an 8-year-old boy presents with bruises on his buttocks, arms, and thighs, and states he is fearful of saying how he got them. So is that reportable or not? Well, that in that case would be reportable. Reason 4 is, remember, suspected abuse, right? We're seeing an indicator here of marks being shared and a hesitancy, fearful, in fact, of sharing how he got them. So reportable under the law. A 19-year-old woman discloses a history of sexual abuse that she has not shared with anyone before. So the question is that reportable or not? Well, actually, in this case, it would be not reportable. And the reason for that is because the individual in this case is 19 years old. And so what's important to note is, though, is that that's not reportable under suspected child abuse, okay? Child abuse. What's important to understand is a crime still took place, right? This is a history of sexual abuse that occurred when this particular young woman was a minor. So law enforcement most definitely needs to be notified in order to conduct an investigation and determine what laws, what charges might be brought about as a result of the disclosed history of abuse. So again, not reportable to a child abuse hotline, but reportable to a law enforcement agency. Okay. An 11-year-old girl says her dad screams at her and calls her names, but does not hit her when she is angry. So reportable, not reportable, would you inquire on that one? That was me. I'm definitely going to inquire. So I realize that this may not fall under the category of abuse, right? At times, children may feel fearful, parents may raise their voice, whatever the case is. However, if this is something that is being somehow toned down or muted when it comes to me, then I would be concerned. And so I would at least, for my own well-being state of mind, I would call this into the hotline and just inquire. And the reason I would do that is I would allow the social worker on the other side of the phone to make a determination if this is worth investigating or if they're going to allow this to sort of continue. And if it's worth investigating, then we would have fulfilled our responsibility to report the suspected abuse. If not, then at least we know we have consulted with a professional who is trained in that arena. Now, let's say a 15-year-old male, discloses he was sexually abused by a family member at a party, but does not know the name of the friend or their address. Okay. Now, that would be reportable, and it would be reportable for a couple of reasons. So once it's reported, at times you are going to encounter information where an individual, due to their age or their memory or whatever the case is, their cognitive status, may not be able to recall details enough to what it seems like for us to identify the potential abuser. However, it's important to note that a 15-year-old male disclosed abuse to us. And so we are legally responsible to report that information. At that point, once we reported it, professionals on the other end will have to utilize their resources, investigation, law enforcement, whatever the case is, to determine if they can identify this family friend. Okay. So again, reportable under California law. So just to recap, I know this is only just a short sort of exercise to kind of engage in some thought related to this topic, but child abuse involves children younger than 18, right? And maybe physical, sexual, psychological, or neglect, right? Or any combination thereof. You will be required by law to report suspected child abuse or known child abuse as a helping professional. It's not your job to investigate the allegations unless, of course, you are an ER response, emergency response social worker, right? Working for Child Protective Services. But you are responsible to report suspected abuse to the proper authorities. Now, what we're going to do is in the final slides, we're going to begin the downward portion of the descent, right, from our flight in this lesson back home. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to spend the next few minutes discussing research related to child maltreatment, so that in the hopes you might better understand the impact that child abuse has on the individual. Okay, so now that we've discussed child maltreatment, its laws, legalities, indicators, right, categories of child maltreatment, one of the things that I stated earlier in this lesson was also to recognize that when we discuss patterns of child maltreatment, when we discuss statistics of abuse rates nationally and locally, it's important to note that we're discussing human lives, right? And when an individual experiences trauma at any point throughout their lifespan, there will be consequences emotionally, physically, cognitively, potentially as a result of that trauma. What's also important to realize, though, is that research has really progressed over the past several decades in assisting practitioners in the medical field as well as in other helping professions, social work, counseling, substance dependency, all of these areas, law enforcement, related to the impact of trauma. We used to think that when a child was abused at a young age, that trauma would carry with them and that it was emotional, almost exclusively emotional, right? So we knew and even expected that as children moved throughout their lifespan, they became young adults, middle-aged adults, late adults, that the emotional trauma that they're experiencing could potentially be carried with them the rest of their lives. We used to speculate decades ago, and even in fact, in some cases deny that there was any sort of physiological trauma that would take place as a result of that, until a particular study was done called the ACES study. Now, ACES study stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Okay, that's this study here. All right, it was a study that was conducted in 1998. And what it is it's an important study that I want to highlight for you all, because this will be a standard of reference. If you've not heard of the ACES study already, you will hear continually throughout your career, if you are working with children in healthcare settings, if you're working as a counselor, whatever the case is, this study is widely cited and referred to, and a plethora of studies have come forth as a result of this initial study. But ACES, or the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, was launched in 1998, okay? And the CDC advertised this Adverse Childhood study, okay? And what happened was it uncovered the linkage between childhood trauma and, this was important to note, not only emotional disruption or challenges later on in an individual's life, but chronic diseases that an individual developed as adults as a result of social and emotional trauma that was experienced in the past. And these diseases included things like heart disease, lung cancer, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, as well as emotional, right, challenges such as depression, violence, right, and other things like intimate partner violence or domestic violence and suicide. And so what happened was this study was conducted. It was a 10-year study in which 17,000 people were involved. It was the largest study of its time in 1998. And what happened was that CDC worked with Kaiser. And what they did was they explored through a survey childhood abuse that took place in multiple categories within an individual's life. And what they did was they then followed the medical records of those individuals throughout their adulthood and determined that when trauma was present, other physiological illnesses, including these here, all right, were present in adulthood. And so there are basically 10 types of childhood trauma questions that are measured in the ACES study. I'm going to show those to you. 5 are in the area of personal, regarding things like physical, verbal, sexual abuse, physical neglect, right, and emotional neglect. 5 are related to other family members, right? Environment, right? Remember, we talked about nature and nurture, environment impacting a child's experience in the home. Things like, was a parent an alcoholic? Was a mother a victim of domestic violence? Things like that. And each point, every time an individual answered yes to one of the questions on the ACES study, all right, that counted as 1 point. So if a person who has been physically abused, right, and also had an alcoholic parent and a mother who was beaten up in their household, then they would have an ACES score of 3. Okay, so that's just an example of that. So let me show you the questions here. So the questions on the survey were these questions here. And prior to your 18th birthday, again, were these adverse experiences attributed or occur within childhood, right? Did a parent or adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down? Okay, so verbal abuse, right? We're talking about, did a parent or another adult in the household push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, right? Physical abuse. Here's sexual abuse, right? Touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way. Did no one in your family love you or thought that you were, not important or not special? This could be neglect, emotional neglect, right? And then in regards to physical neglect, that you didn't have enough to eat. You had to wear dirty clothes. You had no one to protect you. This is also under neglect. And then these 5 questions related to separation and divorce, right? Domestic violence here, right? Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, things like this? Did you ever live with anyone who was a problem drinker, alcoholic, or used street drugs? So this is looking for substance dependency that was present in the home. Mental illness such as depression, right? Or suicidality present in the home. And was anyone incarcerated in your home? These were all determined to be factors of legitimate trauma that a child could experience in their life. And as a result, it set forward a series of choices, actions, patterns, and in fact, a physiological response that would play out later in an adult's life. And so some of you I know may be a little skeptical to that, saying, how can an incident that occurred when you're 3, 4, 5 years old impact your physiology, right, later in life? And so I'd like to unpack that for really quick. Here's some key highlights related to the study, right? 17,000 participants, 1 in 4 were exposed to 2 categories of ACEs, right? So 25%, 1 in 16 were exposed to 4 or more categories. That means they said yes to 4 or more of these questions here. And individuals who experienced 4 or more of these incidents growing up were more prone to emotional, psychological, and physiological, okay, challenges in adulthood. So to address that question of why, what is this all about, right? How can that happen? First, let me apologize for that going on. Don't worry, I'll explain that in a second. Let's look at the impact of trauma as it occurs throughout the lifespan so that I can paint a picture for you on how this all plays out. So imagine that you're 3, 4, 5 years old and you experience either chronic or acute episodes of childhood trauma in your life. Chronic meaning ongoing, so maybe occurring for months or years, maybe from the age of 3 to 5, right? Or acute meaning one really awful and intense experience of domestic violence or trauma or something like that present in the home. Well, what happens is there's actually a physiological disruption to your neurodevelopment. The physiology of the brain, specifically hormonal substances within the brain that I'm going to discuss in the next slide, are impacted by trauma, and I'm going to explain those, okay? But as a result of that, what happens is you have this disruption, right, neurologically, that occurs. Well, what happens then is that there also can lead to a social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And so what happens is individuals then at some point may feel that due to some of the disruption of the neurodevelopment, all right, that their thinking patterns, their social reactions in situations are then impacted negatively. As a result of that, individuals may adopt risky health behaviors. And so I'm going to unpack that in a second. From those behaviors, disease, disability, and other social problems manifest. And if those continue throughout an individual's lifespan, it can lead to, this is what is early death, okay, here. So let's take a child who was abused sexually, okay? Let's say from 3 to 5 years old, chronic abuse, 3 to 5 years old, sexual abuse. Well, there are going to be some fundamental differences in brain function that we'll discuss in the next slide. As a result of that, a child may feel, as they move throughout the lifespan, nervous about engaging in relationships with partners. They may start to feel that they have inadequacy or feel inadequate in pursuing a partner that is healthy, that respects them, that looks out for their safety and well-being. And so that individual may choose to engage in relationships out of a feeling of worthlessness, anger, and even depression, choosing partners that are not compatible, all right, with what should be their feeling of self-worth and value. And so what happens is that individual then, in order to cope with those stressors, those feelings of inadequacy, those feelings of anger and depression, may choose to start smoking, drinking, engaging in multiple sexual relationships with multiple partners as a result of those behaviors to address those emotional and cognitive feelings. And so what happens is then that if we already know that if you smoke, drink, and engage in a number of sexual partners, then you are at risk to certain diseases, lung disease, cardiovascular, sexually transmitted diseases. If that behavior continues for too long, an individual obviously can die from those diseases. And so this is how the notion of childhood trauma and the ACES study informed our understanding of childhood trauma working its way through the system. Now, finally, what I want to do is explain this category here, disrupted neurodevelopment. So some of you are asking, well, how is it that the brain is impacted by trauma? Now, I'm going to give you a very short explanation to all of this. But later, if you choose to have more questions or you want to hear more about this, I'm happy to engage in a little conversation with you on this to assist in your understanding. I'm happy to do that. For the sake of this conversation, what I would like to do is draw us into this model referred to as the triune brain. And the triune brain, tri meaning three, is going to zero us into three particular areas of the brain: the neocortex, the limbic system, and the brain system, sometimes referred to, the brain stem, sometimes referred to as the reptilian portion of our brain. The limbic system is where, in particular, our emotional response to outward stimuli takes place. This is the area of the brain that induces our feelings. When someone is speaking, that we sometimes seek to connect with the message that's spoken and seek within our own memories experiences that may mirror what the speaker is discussing. So as I was discussing child maltreatment, for example, if you know of someone who has experienced child maltreatment, has also gone through a difficult time in their lives, your heart may go out to that individual. That emotional response to what I am saying is cued in your limbic system. The brain system, as you're sitting, the brain stem, as you're sitting and hearing me speak right now, maybe you're sitting calmly in front of a computer or whatever the case is cueing you to breathe, to swallow, to blink your eyes, to do all of those other things. While you are taking in the information. And the neocortex, that large frontal lobe of your brain around your forehead right here, is that area of the brain that's taking the information that you are hearing right now. And hopefully what it's doing is retaining that and also creating new thoughts as you analyze this material, a new understanding of how childhood trauma impacts the brain. So it's actually applying this knowledge and developing new knowledge with it, okay? And so what's happening then is important to understand. There's also another part of your brain around this area referred to as the amygdala. And so anytime you're in a stressful situation, okay, any stressful situation, that part of the brain called the amygdala reduces a small amount of a hormone into your bloodstream. That hormone is called cortisol. Sometimes it's also referred to as the stress hormone, okay? Now, it's referred to the stress hormone because it's released during stressful situations. And so what's also important to note that is this stress hormone, as it's pumped into your bloodstream, cortisol also serves other functions within the human body. Cortisol in particular can help control things like blood sugar. It can regulate our metabolism, reduce inflammation, blood pressure, and it can increase memory retention. Now, research also shows that an imbalance of cortisol, delivered from the reptilian brain or the brain stem, can also lead to other issues later on in life. So individuals at a young age who have been in high stress situations, traumatic events, their brain has continuously pumped higher levels of cortisol into the bloodstream. This has created a physiological response to stress that, as a result, creates problems regarding blood sugar regulation, metabolism, inflammation, and things like this. And so this is how episodes of trauma can directly impact a person's anatomy later on in life or throughout their lifespan. This is why so many individuals may die of chronic health problems, and not only as a result of the substances that they were using or the choices and lifestyle that they made, but those substances and choices were attributed to stressors that they had experienced at a very young age in their lives. Okay, I want to thank you for hanging in there today. I know this lesson was a little bit longer than some of the previous lessons, but I really wanted to take time to unpack child maltreatment in particular because it is one of those topics that I have seen firsthand heavily impact lifespan development. Any of the trauma that's experienced at a young age in an individual's life has the potential to carry forward with them long into adulthood. Some of you may also experience in your interviews where individuals that are 65 or older, right, are sharing traumatic events that they have experienced in their lives with you. That's an example of this childhood trauma staying with them throughout their lives, right? It's also important to note and that childhood trauma and abuse also includes other things, particularly in utero drug exposure. So over the course of my career, I've worked with children who were in utero exposed to substances and later had severe cognitive challenges as a result of the substances they were exposed to within the womb while the mother was pregnant. Okay. In particular, I want to draw our attention to two: cocaine and methamphetamines. Now, obviously, there are other drugs that have severe consequences on the development of a fetus within the womb. I'm drawing our attention to these two in particular because in the course of my career, I was, how do I say, I was both fascinated and horrified, honestly, by the consequences of in utero drug exposure of these particular two drugs. Just devastating in so many ways. Cocaine in utero exposure in particular can create a few problems for brain development. Remember, we were just talking about neurological development here and the triune brain. Well, when cocaine is present in utero, there's some other issues that are impacting neurodevelopment. Okay. One is that a thinner frontal cortex, all right, is created. And so that front part of the brain that deals with processing information, generating new thoughts and knowledge is impacted, literally thinner than other brains who have not been exposed to cocaine in utero. It also leads to an altered limbic system. And if you remember from our discussion on the triune brain, the limbic system, all right, also assists with managing emotions, right? And so individuals now are being born in utero exposed to cocaine with a thinner frontal cortex and a flawed limbic system. And this is a heavy repercussion for an individual to attempt to regulate and process information later on in their life and have emotional response to it that could potentially be damaging depending on their setting, right? What we've also seen is a reduced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So those two work together in order to communicate, to rationalize, to sense fear, to learn. And when those two aren't firing symbiotically and they're not working together as they should, this can create severe problems for an individual later in their life, delayed growth patterns for that individual, lack of cause and effect. I have literally seen children who were exposed in utero to cocaine in brain scans where the portion of the brain that is responsible for assisting with cause and effect is literally rotted away. And so what we see is imagine an individual becoming an adult, right, without a fully developed area of the brain that can assist them with reasoning between cause and effect, right? That's extremely dangerous for an individual. Individuals in which that portion of the brain is also missing oftentimes will lack remorse. They genuinely will not feel sorry for hurting others. It's not even a concept that they are capable of. And other issues related to self-regulation. When we are not able to regulate ourselves and we are not able to regulate our emotions because that part of the brain has been damaged as well, this can lead to verbal outbursts, physical outbursts, extreme and sudden violent episodes. And I've witnessed all of this in children as a result of in utero cocaine exposure. So we'll see similar negative impact on the brain and neurodevelopment related to methamphetamine exposure as well. Again, the prefrontal cortex is impacted, the hippocampus in particular, the amygdala, expression, facial affect I have seen is not aligned with the emotions that an individual is feeling. So this is where an individual may say that they're feeling stressed and worried and fearful of what's going on in their lives, but due to the exposure to methamphetamines and impaired neurological development, they may be smiling while they say it, right? um, difficulty paying attention, and engaging in social relationships. And so again, when the brain is impacted, right, by in utero drug exposure, this drastically impacts an individual's ability to function successfully throughout their lifespan. So this is why it's really important. Finally, at-risk populations. And so really, what's really important to understand is if you are working in the helping professions, what's important to understand is child abuse can impact anyone, right? There is no distinguishing causality that only impacts one individual, a type of individual or child related to child abuse. It does not discriminate. But what's also important to understand is that when children are involved within certain systems of their lives, or when certain factors are impacting that child's development socially, or emotionally, they are at higher risks of experiencing childhood trauma than other groups. Okay. And so if there are children falling within some of these populations, they are at higher risks of experience trauma, and also experiencing challenges throughout their lifespan development, similar to what we had seen in the ACES study related to that trauma. So children who have been abused and neglected, obviously sexually abused, children who have either themselves been suicidal or self-injurious, or have been in households where an individual was suicidal or self-injuring, right? That can have a profound impact on a child's development, and that is traumatic, right? Substances, right? Using substances or being around others who have used them, abused them, that is traumatic. Intellectually disabled children are at risk of higher rates of abuse. They unfortunately are determined to be targets of abuse, and that's so sad to see. Members of the LGBTQ plus community have historically not only experienced higher rates of emotional, physical, sexual abuse, but also combined with the social stigma of being identified as LGBTQ plus also impacts that individual severely emotionally and cognitively. And so that can be detrimental to an individual's development, right? An individual who's traveling from another country as an immigrant or refugee oftentimes may engage in a perilous and traumatic journey, which impacts their development. Obviously, children involved in these three systems of child welfare, mental health, and juvenile justice, even though these systems are there to offer support to children, we refer to these systems as also at times creating secondary trauma. Secondary trauma means that when a child has to be moved from one foster home to the next, when they have to change therapists, when they are transferred or violated on their probation terms, this also leads to trauma that children may experience in their life. And so the very systems that are there to assist children can also sometimes lead to a secondary mode of trauma in their lives. And so really, that's about all the information that I want to offer you today related to child maltreatment. I know that this was a lot, and I know that this is a very heavy topic. And so what we'll do is we will move after this slide into our centering activity and close out today's lesson. But I also want to encourage you that if you have questions, thoughts, concerns related to the material, you are always more than welcome to reach out to me. I am happy to discuss this with you, and we can certainly do that.